You wake up at 6 in the morning to your phone alarm, and before even getting out of bed, you're already checking notifications. 27 unread messages, 15 emails, 42 social media notifications. Your heart rate accelerates slightly. That familiar feeling of anxiety settles in your chest. You don't know why, but you feel like you're late for something you can't even define. It's Sunday. There's nothing urgent waiting for you, but the feeling persists like a shadow that accompanies every movement, every breath. If you recognize this experience, you're not alone. In fact, you're part of something much larger and more significant than you imagine. We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of pandemic, one that doesn't spread through respiratory droplets or physical contact, but through something much more subtle and invasive. This new pandemic is emotional, invisible to the eye, but devastatingly real in its effects. And it has already infected billions of people around the world. The word pandemic, derived from the Greek pan and demos, literally means all the people. Historically, we associate pandemics with biological agents. The Black Plague that decimated a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, the Spanish flu that killed more people than World War I, or more recently, COVID-19 that fundamentally transformed our social reality. But if we expand our understanding of pandemic to include phenomena that spread globally and affect the health of entire populations, we discover that we are in the midst of a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Since the beginning of the 21st century, something began to spread silently through our connected societies. It's not a virus we can detect in laboratories or a bacterium we can observe through microscopes. It's something much more complex and disturbing. An epidemic of emotional disconnection, generalized anxiety, and existential emptiness that is redefining what it means to be human in the information age. The symptoms of this emotional pandemic are subtle at first, almost imperceptible. They begin with small mood changes, difficulties concentrating, a persistent feeling that something is wrong, even when everything appears to be fine. The infected person may notice that laughing has become more difficult, that joy seems more distant, that genuine human connections begin to feel like work instead of natural pleasure. Gradually, a kind of emotional anesthesia develops, where life's highs and lows are replaced by a gray monotony. The individual can function normally, go to work, maintain superficial relationships, fulfill their social obligations, but inside, there is a growing sensation of living on autopilot, disconnected from their own vital experience. The spread of this emotional pandemic is intrinsically linked to the digital revolution that has transformed our society in recent decades. Paradoxically, in an era when we are more connected than ever in human history, we experience unprecedented levels of loneliness and isolation. Our smartphones, which promised to connect us to the world, have created a new form of psychological prison. We spend hours daily consuming information fragments, comparing our inner lives with carefully curated representations that others project online, absorbing a constant flow of stimuli that our brains were not evolutionarily prepared to process. The result is a form of cognitive and emotional overload that leaves little space for reflection, for silence, for those moments of quietude where we traditionally found meaning and connection with ourselves. This technological transformation coincided with profound changes in our traditional social structures. Religious communities, which for millennia provided frameworks of meaning and emotional support networks, have lost much of their influence. Extended family structures, which offered stability and continuity across generations, have fragmented under the pressure of geographic mobility and modern economic demands. Collective rituals that marked important life transitions have been replaced by individualized and often empty experiences. The result is a society of theoretically free individuals, but emotionally orphaned, navigating a world that offers infinite options but little real meaning. The modern economy has contributed to this emotional epidemic in ways we are only beginning to understand. Late capitalism has created a culture where human value is measured primarily through productivity and consumption. We are taught from an early age that our self-worth should derive from our professional achievements, our ability to consume goods and experiences, our skill at projecting an image of success to the outside world. This mentality transforms life into a constant competition, where it's never enough to simply exist, where we must always be striving to be more, do more, have more. The result is a form of existential exhaustion, where people feel constantly inadequate, constantly behind in a race that has no finish line. The emotional pandemic also manifests through a crisis of attention that is redefining our capacity to experience depth in any aspect of life. Our attention, which could once focus sustainedly on a single task, experience, or relationship, is now constantly fragmented. We live in an era of perpetual multitasking, where our consciousness jumps from one notification to another, from one stimulus to another, never allowing us to truly delve deeply into anything. This fragmentation of attention is not just a matter of productivity. It affects our ability to form meaningful memories, to experience emotional intimacy, to find satisfaction in activities that require patience and persistence. We are losing the ability to be fully present in our own lives. What makes this pandemic particularly insidious is that its symptoms are frequently interpreted as personal failures. In a culture that values forced positivity and toxic optimism, those who experience the effects of this collective emotional crisis are led to believe that the problem is within them, that they are not sufficiently resilient, sufficiently grateful, sufficiently capable of adapting. This individualization of problems that are fundamentally systemic creates a second layer of suffering. Not only do we experience emptiness, anxiety, and disconnection, but we also blame ourselves for these experiences, creating a cycle of shame that makes recovery even more difficult. The emotional pandemic is also transforming our relationship with time in profound and disturbing ways. We live in an era of constant acceleration, where the pace of technological, social, and economic change exceeds our capacity for psychological processing. Our grandparents could expect that the skills they learned in youth would remain relevant for decades. Today, knowledge and competencies become obsolete in a matter of years or even months. This planned obsolescence applies not only to technology, but to human experience itself. We are constantly pressured to reinvent ourselves, to adapt, to remain relevant in an economy that treats human beings like software that needs constant updates. I need to pause here to ask you something important. As we explore these ideas together, do you recognize some of these patterns in your own life? That feeling of always running after something indefinite, of never being able to truly relax, even when you should be resting? I know it can be difficult to admit, especially in a culture that teaches us that we should always appear as if we have everything under control. But you are not alone in this experience. If this feeling resonates with you, share your experience in the comments. It can be as simple as writing, "I feel this constant pressure when," and completing it with your personal experience. Your honesty might be exactly what someone needs to read today to realize they are not alone in their struggle against this invisible epidemic. Sometimes, naming what we feel is the first step toward beginning to heal ourselves. One of the most disturbing manifestations of this new pandemic is what we can call lost meaning syndrome. For the first time in human history, we have an entire generation that grew up with virtually unlimited access to information, but with limited access to meaning frameworks that could provide context and purpose to this information. Our ancestors could live more limited lives in terms of choices and opportunities, but these limitations also provided structure, direction, and a clear sense of social role. Today, we are confronted with infinite choices, but without clear criteria for making these choices. The result is a form of existential paralysis, where freedom becomes a burden instead of a blessing. This crisis of meaning is intimately connected to the collapse of what sociologists call master narratives, the great stories that previously gave sense to collective human experience. For centuries, people found purpose through religious, nationalist, ideological, or family narratives that situated their individual lives within larger contexts. These narratives offered not only explanations for suffering and joy, but also directions for moral action and paths to personal fulfillment. The decline of these master narratives has left a void that consumer culture and digital technology cannot adequately fill. Technology, which was supposed to free us from many forms of human suffering, is actually creating new forms of psychological imprisonment. The algorithms that govern our social media feeds were designed to maximize engagement, not well-being. They discovered that content that provokes outrage, envy, fear, or compulsive desire keeps our attention for longer than content that promotes satisfaction, gratitude, or inner peace. The result is that we are constantly exposed to stimuli that activate our stress systems, that keep us in a state of low but constant alert. Our brains, which evolved to deal with occasional and specific threats, are now constantly flooded with signals of danger, competition, and inadequacy. This chronic stress overload is literally remodeling our brains. Neuroscientific studies show that prolonged exposure to stress decreases the volume of the hippocampus, the region responsible for memory formation and emotional regulation, while increasing the volume of the amygdala, the center of fear and anxiety. Essentially, our brains are being physically altered by digital culture in ways that make us less capable of experiencing calm, less capable of forming rich and meaningful memories, and more prone to anxiety and depression. We are witnessing neurological evolution in real time, but in a direction that reduces rather than increases our potential for happiness and fulfillment. The emotional pandemic is also redefining our relationship with solitude and silence. In traditional cultures, periods of silence and reflection were considered essential for spiritual and emotional development. Today, we live in a culture that treats silence as something to be filled, solitude as something to be avoided at any cost. Our smartphones ensure that we never need to experience true silence or genuine solitude. But this aversion to emptiness has a profound cost. We lose contact with our inner world, with that space of quietude where we traditionally found insight, creativity, and emotional renewal. Without regular moments of genuine introspection, we develop a form of emotional amnesia where we lose the capacity to process and integrate our experiences. The impact of this emotional pandemic on younger generations is particularly alarming. Children and adolescents who grew up entirely in the digital age are exhibiting levels of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation that have no historical precedents. These young people have never experienced a world where attention was not constantly fragmented, where self-esteem was not measured through likes and comments, where social comparison was not constant and global. For them, toxic hyperconnectivity is not a difficult adaptation. It is simply reality. The result is a generation that is technically sophisticated but emotionally fragile, globally connected but profoundly lonely, informationally rich but spiritually hungry. This new form of pandemic is also creating social divisions of types that have never existed before. Just as biological pandemics affect different populations in different ways, the emotional pandemic creates new forms of inequality. Those who have resources to disconnect periodically from hyperconnectivity, who can pay for therapy, meditation, silence retreats, who have jobs that allow control over their time and attention, are developing a form of emotional immunity. Meanwhile, those trapped in jobs that require constant connectivity, who don't have resources for mental health care, who live in overcrowded urban environments with little access to nature, become more vulnerable to the devastating effects of this invisible epidemic. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this emotional pandemic is how it is altering our capacity to form authentic human connections. Genuine intimacy requires presence, vulnerability, and time. Three things that our modern culture makes increasingly scarce. Our relationships are being mediated by technologies that privilege quick and superficial communication over deep and nuanced dialogue. We are losing the ability to tolerate the uncomfortable silences that precede important insights, to navigate complex conflicts that cannot be resolved with an emoji, to experience that kind of connection that emerges when two people are truly present to each other without distractions. The modern economy has exacerbated this crisis by transforming time into a scarce commodity. In a world where time is money, investing time in relationships, contemplation, or activities that don't produce immediately measurable results begins to seem like a luxury that few can afford. We have developed an efficiency mentality that extends to all aspects of life, including our emotional and spiritual life. We want meditation techniques that work in 5 minutes, therapy that resolves complex problems in a few sessions, relationships that are always gratifying and never require difficult work. This emotional fast food mentality leaves us chronically undernourished at a psychological level, always seeking quick solutions for hungers that require slow and sustained nourishment. The emotional pandemic is also transforming our relationship with nature and our own body. We spend most of our lives in artificial environments, under artificial lighting, breathing filtered air, looking at screens instead of horizons. Our circadian rhythms, which evolved over millions of years to synchronize with natural cycles of light and darkness, are constantly disrupted by the blue light of electronic devices and the artificial schedules of modern life. We have lost touch with the seasonal rhythms that previously structured human life, with the cycles of rest and activity that our bodies still expect. This disconnection from our natural biological rhythms contributes to a profound sense of being misaligned, of living against the current of our own nature. But here's the crucial question. Recognizing this emotional pandemic should not lead us to despair or unproductive nostalgia for an idealized past. Instead, it should inspire us to develop new forms of emotional immunity, new practices, and social structures that allow us to take advantage of the benefits of modern technology while preserving our essential humanity. The solution is not to abandon technology, but to develop a more conscious and intentional relationship with it. It's not to return to obsolete social structures, but to create new forms of community that respond to fundamental human needs within the context of contemporary reality. This emotional immunity begins with awareness, recognizing that many of the feelings of anxiety, inadequacy, and disconnection that we experience are not personal deficiencies, but natural responses to social and technological conditions that are genuinely toxic to human well-being. This awareness allows us to stop blaming ourselves and begin taking proactive measures to protect our emotional health. It means learning to say no to hyperconnectivity, establishing boundaries with technology, prioritizing real relationships over digital interactions, and investing time in activities that nourish our soul rather than just our productivity. Developing resistance to this emotional pandemic also requires that we rediscover the art of attention. In an era of constant distraction, the ability to focus our consciousness in a sustained and intentional way becomes a revolutionary skill. Meditation, contemplation, deep reading, unhurried conversations, walks in nature without electronic devices. These are not romantic luxuries, but basic necessities for psychological health in the digital age. They are ways to recover our capacity to be fully present in our own lives, to experience depth instead of just surface. Healing from this emotional pandemic also requires that we create new forms of ritual and meaning that are relevant to our contemporary reality. This doesn't necessarily mean returning to religious traditions, although for some that may be part of the solution. It means developing regular practices that connect us with something larger than our individual egos, that mark important transitions in our lives, that remind us of our deepest values amid the chaos of daily life. It can be as simple as family dinner without electronic devices, or as elaborate as creating community groups focused on questions of meaning and purpose. A crucial part of healing is also learning to tolerate and even embrace certain types of discomfort that our culture teaches us to avoid. Boredom, for example, is not an emergency that needs to be immediately resolved with stimulus. It's a mental state that can lead to creativity and insight if we allow it to persist. Loneliness is not necessarily an indication that something is wrong. It can be an opportunity to connect more deeply with ourselves. Anxiety about the future, while painful, can be a signal that we need to realign our lives with our most important values. Learning to navigate these emotional states with presence and wisdom, instead of compulsively avoiding them, is an essential skill for mental health in the modern era. Recovery from this emotional pandemic also requires changes at social and political levels. We need laws and cultural norms that protect our psychological well-being in the same way we protect our physical health. This might include regulations on how technology companies can use our attention and data, work policies that guarantee the right to disconnect, investment in public spaces that promote contemplation and community instead of just consumption and efficiency. We need to recognize that mental health is not just individual responsibility, but a public health issue that requires collective action. Education also needs to be reimagined to prepare people not just for the job market, but for emotional life in a complex era. This means teaching emotional regulation skills from an early age, critical digital literacy, the capacity to form authentic relationships, and competencies for finding meaning and purpose. We need to educate people to be resilient, not just economically, but emotionally and spiritually. As we navigate this new reality, it's important to remember that genuine change is always possible. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and regeneration. The same neuroplasticity that allows our brains to be negatively shaped by toxic culture also allows them to be positively remodeled through conscious practices and healthy environments. Each moment of mindfulness, each authentic conversation, each period of contemplative silence contributes to our individual and collective recovery. Perhaps it's useful to think of this emotional pandemic not just as a crisis, but as an evolutionary opportunity. Crises force adaptation, and adaptation can lead to higher forms of functioning. It's possible that we are in the middle of a painful but necessary transition to forms of consciousness and social organization that are more adequate to the realities of the 21st century. This emotional pandemic may be forcing us to develop capacities that were previously spiritual luxuries into practical necessities: mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, the ability to find inner peace amid outer chaos. The question is not whether we will emerge from this emotional pandemic. Eventually we will. The question is, what kind of humanity we will become in the process? Will we use this crisis as an opportunity to develop greater emotional maturity, healthier communities, and more human technologies? Or will we remain trapped in dysfunctional patterns until the pressure becomes unbearable? The choice is ours, both individually and collectively. If these reflections have touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found words to express, know that you are not alone. At this moment, millions of people around the world are experiencing the effects of this invisible emotional pandemic. By subscribing to this channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who are committed not just to understanding these challenges, but to developing practical wisdom for navigating through them. Each week, we explore together strategies for cultivating genuine emotional well-being in an era that often seems designed to leave us anxious and disconnected. This is not just information, but an invitation to a different way of living. Join us in this journey of collective recovery. Subscribe so we can continue exploring together how to live with more wisdom and less suffering in a world that is being redesigned every day. The future of humanity may well depend on our capacity to recognize and respond to this emotional pandemic. Just as we learn to protect ourselves from biological threats through medicine and hygiene, we need to learn to protect ourselves from psychological threats through wisdom and contemplative practice. The choice is in our hands. We can remain unconscious, allowing this invisible epidemic to continue devastating our capacity for joy and connection, or we can awaken to our situation and begin the long but essential work of individual and collective healing. The first step is always the same: recognizing that we have a problem. The second is deciding that we deserve something better. And the third is beginning today itself to build the emotional immunity that will allow us not just to survive, but to thrive in the era that is being born.
I would assume that us having more information and more access to information would lead to more truth, less conspiracy, more agreement, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. Most information in the world is junk. It's like with food. There was a time, like a century ago in many countries, where food was scarce. So people ate whatever they could get, especially it was full of fat and sugar, and they thought that more food is always good. Like if you ask your great-grandmother, she would tell you, yes, more food is always good. And then we reach a time of abundance, and we have all this industrialized processed food, which is artificially full of fat and sugar and salt and whatever. And it's obviously bad for us. The idea that more food is always good, no. And definitely not all this junk food. And the same thing has happened with information.
Are you positive, are you optimistic, or are you pessimistic for our future? I know it's a hard question.
I try to be a realist. I mean, basically optimism is like saying, oh, everything will be okay. And pessimism, no, we are all doomed. Both these positions, they make us abdicate responsibility. If in the end everything will be okay, why bother? You don't need to take action. And it's the same if we are doomed, so why waste whatever little time we have on taking action? Realism is understanding that we have, as human beings, as a human species, we still have the resources, the technology, the wisdom to deal with major challenges, whether it's climate change or whether it's the rise of AI.
When comparing AI, say, to the threat of nuclear war has no upside. It has no supporters. It's a huge, huge threat, especially in today's world, when we see that countries like Russia are just completely disregarding the biggest taboos of the international system Since 1945, the biggest taboo of the international system was that a strong country cannot just invade and try to conquer and destroy a weaker country. And now this is broken. So the danger is huge, but at least everybody understands the danger. There are no winners in a nuclear war. With AI, it's a much more complicated challenge. There is a huge positive potential, and people find it very difficult to understand what the threats are. Ever since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was at least clear to humans what is the danger of nuclear technology. You don't need long explanations. With AI, it's difficult to grasp the danger because it's really an alien threat.